Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. Following a detailed application process, my business partner Kelly Barner was one of just 100 content creators selected by LinkedIn earlier this year for the inaugural LinkedIn Creator Accelerator program, and the only creator in the procurement space. What followed was 12 weeks of content creation across multiple channels dedicated to the topic of supplier diversity, along with the support and coaching of the LinkedIn team along the way. So in today's show, I had a conversation with Kelly about the program with the intention to focus on two topics of conversation. First, we talked specifically about the LinkedIn Creator Accelerator. What is it? What was involved? And any tips that listeners can take who are considering sharing content on LinkedIn, whether that's for your personal brand or for your business brand. We then dig into Kelly's findings around the health, the challenges, and the prospects of supplier diversity programs based on countless interviews, live audio sessions, and subsequent comments received over the course of this 12-week program. So let's go into the conversation. And the first question I asked Kelly is if she could share more about the LinkedIn Creator Accelerator program and how she was accepted.
So the simple answer is, it is 10 weeks of pure torture. That's the really simple answer, having, I'm not even, I don't think, 2 weeks off of it. But the more honest, broader answer is that it's a program that LinkedIn invented right at the end of 2021 to not only bring in different kinds of content creators. So one of the big things I learned in the program is that I think of, okay, if I were to put all the LinkedIn content into buckets, there'd be procurement and finance and some IT stuff and all the different functions of an enterprise. Mm-hmm. Well, what they're trying to do is bring in esports and yoga and lifestyle things and mental health and wellness. And not only were they trying to invest in a broader range of creators, they also wanted to make sure that the content lived in LinkedIn. So as opposed to us, say, taking a specific AOP podcast and putting the URL to the site and having people link out to engage or listen, the content actually had to live in LinkedIn for a certain amount of time. So that's what they got out of it. Mm-hmm. The way the program worked is that we were given an opportunity to apply, and we had to provide information about ourselves, but we also had to define a project. So when they reviewed all of the applications, they knew both the kinds of people and the content strengths we were bringing to the table, but also what we wanted to do over the course of that 10 weeks. And I joke, but it was fairly grueling because for a sustained 10 weeks, you had to post 4 pieces of new content a week, and at least one of them had to be a video. So for me personally, that's where my angst was. I'm a writer and a podcaster for a reason. Other people were sort of all video first because they were potentially coming from TikTok as their primary platform, or they were all visual first because they were coming in from Instagram. But it's one of those things where you say, okay, you can do anything for 10 weeks. I gave myself this pep talk multiple times. Do anything for 10 weeks. And you come out of the gate thinking, okay, I generally know who I'm going to interview and the storyline I want to tell. It was sort of really like a podcast narrative on steroids. It was 10 weeks long. About week 3, I think it dawned on me, I need to do this for 7 more weeks. It's incredibly intense keeping up not only the frequency of posting that we needed to do, but maintaining the level of quality, right? You're only going to go through this one time. And so I was very much on guard against sort of content quality fatigue. I didn't want to ever find myself saying, okay, I'm exhausted and I'm out of time, because none of the other work stops. But I have to get out my 3rd or 4th post, or I have to make a video, and you just sort of, chuck something up. So it was both an honor to be selected for the program. There were just 100 of us in the US that went through the first class. And I think the big upside to the challenge of going through it is that it really did come with a sense of accomplishment on the other side. This was not sort of a pampered, oh, I was selected and got to wander down this, flower-strewn path content journey. It was content boot camp for 10 weeks. And that's speaking as someone who has now been predominantly creating content for my job for the last 12 years. So it was an amazing program. I think it was designed to be challenging. I don't think they wanted it to be easy. And I haven't necessarily heard anything specifically from LinkedIn, but based on what I've seen, the range of people and types of content, I certainly hope that they're pleased that they got out of it what they hoped to.
Well, and I know this is something that you'll never say, but I think one of your superpowers is the ability to create a volume of content with really high quality. Like, you don't let your standards slip, and you definitely, I think, needed that as you went through this program, because I mean, it takes a lot of time to create that volume of content, and I think sometimes folks don't see that behind the scenes, that it's not just about showing up and kind of turning on the camera. There's a lot of work that went into every single one of those content pieces that you published.
There was a ton of work, and it's sort of like that classic picture of the iceberg everybody always shows. There's the bit you can see, and then there's the bit under the water that will completely devastate your ship. Because for every piece of content, and I did a lot of interview-based content where I was speaking to people. So it was finding who to talk to, getting them to agree to talk to me, preparing, scheduling, conducting the interview. And then you just have raw content, and now you have to process it. I think if there's anything in looking back, I think I mentally got myself into this place of doing very much what we do at Art of Procurement, or that I do on Dial P, where you bring in experts and you ask them the very best questions you can to sort of almost create new content, because maybe they haven't been asked a question in a certain way. And I think I unintentionally created more of a challenge for myself, because I could have stopped and thought a little bit more and processed, as opposed to focusing on always creating new interviews and more interviews. And it kind of picked up a life and a momentum of its own. I think long term, I'm going to look back and feel like that was a strength. Very short term, looking back, I'm wondering if I sort of created a challenge for myself that didn't have to be that way. But I'm certainly pleased with sort of the story that I was able to tell over the 10 weeks.
And I do want to talk a little bit, towards the end of the conversation, about what did you learn through all of those conversations that you had around the topic of supply diversity. But I think there's some really interesting points to draw out around your experience with LinkedIn, because it's such an omnipresent platform. And it's something that if you aren't investing in LinkedIn, you probably should be investing in LinkedIn. That's whether you are somebody who is a procurement practitioner who wants to engage with folks, raise your profile, always kind of market yourself from a personal brand, or whether you're representing a company who wants to be more present on LinkedIn. Now, one of the things that you were saying that, from a video perspective, there were some folks who maybe came from TikTok or photos from Instagram, and that you really came from the audio and the written background as kind of your primary communication channel. One of the things that LinkedIn did that coincided with this program was to launch an audio product, I want to say, where you could actually have live conversations with folks joining, from just the audience, so to speak. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about that and how your experience of that product was, and because I'm sure it's something that everyone will start to see on LinkedIn pretty soon.
I think so. And it is actually one of the incredibly cool things about the program, that not only did, in the case of LinkedIn live audio events, did we get beta testing access to brand new functionality, they would also set up these work sessions where they would bring in, 8 or 10 of the creators, and they would bring in a specific product team. So part of the insight that I got during this program was starting to understand a little bit how LinkedIn breaks down their product development scope. So for instance, there were sessions focused specifically around how to optimize your profile. There were sessions focused on the reach of content. There were sessions focused just on how do you use messaging and how should messaging work better. And it was incredibly interesting learning from people that had really pushed against the boundaries of some of these pieces of functionality, because even from them giving constructive feedback about how the product could be better, you'd learn, oh, I didn't even know I could do that, right? So we learned a ton. But I particularly jumped on the opportunity. We had to request access and be approved for LinkedIn Live audio events, which I think I would compare most closely if anybody listens to traditional radio talk programs, is sort of what
Hmm.
it comes down to. There is zero video, it just does not exist. There's not even a chat function. So it's not even like a Zoom webinar or a GoToWebinar where you have sort of the dialogue going on the audience on the side. It's literally live broadcast audio just straight through your browser settings. There is no way to restrict access to who can listen, and it announces you're live when you're live. So I know some people with access to company pages or showcase pages can go live sort of in a live stream sense. This is just voice. And as you run the event, you see the little profile circles pop up of any of the people that are listening. They have emojis so that they can engage with speakers. And the moderator of each event, which was the role that I was in as a beta tester, was I had the option to either pre-designate who my speakers were going to be, or I had the option to say to the audience, if you want to come up stage, raise your hand and I'll pull you up. But the format, I certainly used it to great effect between, you and Helen McKenzie and Canda Rozier and some of the other folks that we had join us over the course of the project. But I think the best thing about it was how candid it encouraged everyone to be in the discussion. We go through this again in the process of preparing guests to come on Art of Procurement. We see the range of people that some will say, listen, I don't even want to know what we're going to talk about. Just put time in my calendar and surprise me. And whatever it
Yeah.
is, I'll be able to talk about it. And other people, we're coaching them through, please, if you could just put the notes away, please. You know what you're talking about. You are incredibly passionate and convincing on this subject. We can hear that you're looking at notes. Please push the papers away. You really have to be authentic and spontaneous and in the moment with this. And I think, there were a couple of times that, people might not have had a great audio connection. We always work through that kind of thing. But to me, the quality of the ideas exchange, because it was so in the wild, was unbelievably powerful. And I think without having any sort of a visual to fall back on, we've changed how we use so many of these content platforms over the course of the pandemic, where in the past, sure, maybe you had Zoom, but you never turned the camera on.
Right.
Now it's sort of this expected, okay, now the camera's on. And I'll be honest, I get distracted. I'm trying to figure out what a picture is of behind somebody, or I'm trying to figure out what the books are on their bookcase, or you start watching if someone talks with their hands, and I'm guilty of this too. You start watching the person's hands. Literally just having audio, to me, made it that much easier to focus on the content of the conversation. And I actually think it's an incredibly powerful medium. There's a reason that radio has existed as a medium for so long, both because of how it affects the conversation and what we would call content creation, but also what it does around the listening experience. This was something that you could be listening to a LinkedIn Live audio event right off your cell phone in your pocket as you're walking along. It was
Hmm.
truly live format podcast in a way, unproduced, also unrecorded, unless you found sort of an unembedded way to do that. But I personally found that for all of the prep that we've already talked through, that I went through for so many of these other interviews, I felt like sometimes the best insights were sparked between the different participants of those live audio events.
Yeah, and as a content creator, using that as your base content, you can then go and repurpose it in so many different ways, which I think is one of the other powers. Hopefully they have a native way to record ultimately, although that's not in the tool right now. And it's really bringing things like Clubhouse or Twitter Spaces into
Yes.
LinkedIn, but having a more of a focused B2B conversation. So
B2B, and also I think really this notion of open access.
Yeah.
We always go through decisions around, okay, what do you gate and what do you not gate, and how does it help you to have a bigger audience, but maybe restrict you to not know who they are? I think to me, this signals that the trend is going to be, I was never on Clubhouse I'm too old to learn new platforms. But I know you had to get like a friend to invite you to come and be in there. I'm sure there was a reason for that. But this really swings the pendulum towards no, content creation should be an open exercise. And I think some people are going to be more comfortable with that than others, but I actually think it's going to help all of us take our thought process, if nothing else, to the next level.
Now, as you went through the program and, you had access to folks at LinkedIn, who provide insights like you were just sharing about before. And obviously you experienced and experimented with different types of content and different ways with engaging with people. What were some of the things that you took away in terms of your lessons learned for actually being active and engaged, and doing so in a way that really gives you a great return on LinkedIn? Were there any things you didn't know or surprises about how LinkedIn works that you learned from the program?
Yeah, there were a few things. I think the biggest one of all, this came as a total shock to me. Stop sharing other people's posts.
Yeah.
So the algorithm is set up to sort of promote some content and not exactly suppress other content, but it doesn't go as far. And so I always thought of it as the ultimate compliment. If I'm reading a post and I'm like, oh, this post by Helen is fascinating, I should share it with my network. The LinkedIn algorithm actually suppresses that. What they want you to do instead is comment and use hashtags or tag other people to bring them into the discussion. So I think for me, that was the biggest learning that
Hmm.
changed both how I interact with LinkedIn, but it also changed. You don't want to be totally algorithm driven, but you do want to understand sort of the base rules of how this stuff works. I also think I'll speak for myself. I go to LinkedIn and I think about engagement. It is a mistake to forget about your profile. And so making sure you have an up-to-date photo sounds like a small thing. It is critical. Even the functionality they have, and I think you have to do it on a smartphone, but you can record something like a 30-second little intro video of yourself so that when you
Yeah.
hover over your picture, very effective. And it's one of those things where your profile, not officially, but sort of unofficially earns points in terms of being complete. Um, and maybe the other thing that I hadn't given a lot of thought to, but that I had people comment to me about as I went through the program, as you share content, whether it's a post or an article or absolutely anything you've created, you can feature that on your profile. More people use that than you would think. So you might think about your LinkedIn profile as being complete because it's up to date with your latest title and job description in the company where you work. But that's really not where the engagement that you will get from a networking standpoint comes from. It's all based off of your comments and how you participate in discussions, what you choose to post yourself as new content, what you say in response to other people's. So I think that was the other thing that I would suggest. When we think about ROI from LinkedIn as a networking site,
Hmm.
you want to make sure where you're spending time gets you what you want. And if getting noticed and meeting new people is what you want, hopefully that's why most people are on LinkedIn. It's less the information about you and more the content or the ideas, or it doesn't even have to be something that you write. You can take a link to an article from the Wall Street Journal or, the Art of Procurement podcast, and you can share that with your network. And so you're going to start to represent your thought process and your perspective in all that. I think giving more thought to what your content and activity says about you is another one of the key takeaways that I had from the program.
Yeah, and as we get to know, and learn more about the LinkedIn algorithms, and we're obviously really active as Art of Procurement
Yes.
on LinkedIn. It's interesting to see how. I mean, this is obvious when you think about it that LinkedIn wants to keep you engaged on their platform. They don't want you to link out of LinkedIn, which is, one of the reasons why they're creating all these tools for you to do things like, have audio events and have the
Yeah.
LinkedIn lives and videos, all on platform. So as much as you can keep your conversations within platforms, so not including links externally, is actually really powerful for supporting engagement so that you get seen more. The other thing I'm seeing at the moment, and I'd love to know if you're kind of seeing that as well, is you see so often people are tagging everybody. They'll post something and then they'll tag 50 people. With a view of extending their reach by doing so, because it's going to show up in all these 50 people's notifications. But actually, if the people that you tag don't engage with the content, and by engagement I mean leaving a comment as opposed to just liking it, then it's actually going to depress your the reach of your post unless people are going to see it, because they want to stop people just, basically spamming folks through tagging them.
And as we all learn about those kinds of things, it does create sort of an odd, I don't know, like an odd etiquette dynamic, right? So now that we know that, does that obligate us to go engage in some way beyond, like, clap, heart, whatever those things are called?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily. I remember there was a time when you were very careful about who you accepted a connection request from, because
Yeah.
that sort of exposed your network, right? Each of us was sort of set up as a gatekeeper to the people we were connected to. And I feel like that's a trend that has changed. I mean, I would still never accept a request from a spammy or, bot seeming kind of
You still
profile.
have a nose for that, for who to say yes and who to say no to.
Yeah, exactly. You kind of know what's real. You know who's going to, you accept their profile as one thing, and then, oh, funny, next day I'm getting spammy messages from them. But I think that just like the trend on the content side is more towards open, less gated participation by all, I think the same idea kind of exists on the other side. And as long as someone seems legit, you should have contact. But now that same line from before around connecting with profiles has sort of moved into content. So if someone is tagging you all the time and you don't enjoy the content, or it's not relevant to your audience, you almost owe it to your audience not to engage, just like back in the day you would have owed it to your audience not to go ahead and accept that request that would then, expose them to notifications. So it's
Mm-hmm.
always this delicate balance of thinking through what are the benefits of engaging and sort of being open-minded towards things versus, okay, what is this going to start to project into my network, and how does that alter how I look online? It continues to be, and I think deliberately so, complicated. I don't think they want it to be straightforward, because as soon as it is, we're all just going to start gaming it. That's just
Right.
the reality.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about supply diversity. You spent 10 weeks creating content around supply diversity. You spoke to countless people across, with perspectives all across the supply diversity spectrum. I'd love to know some of the things, kind of the key findings that you had, and what you learned from all these conversations, or perhaps what you heard in the conversations that reinforced assumptions or challenged assumptions that you may have had.
I think the biggest thing that I learned is actually something that never really went into any of my content, but I figured out very early on. And as I've mentioned, an awful lot of the content that I created was interview based. And I was often interviewing people that I didn't previously know. There was some people that are part of our network that I knew this was an important topic to them. And so those were sort of familiar conversations on the subject. But when you're talking to someone and interviewing them for the very first time, and the subject matter is race, gender identity, disability potentially, these are very sensitive issues. And so for me, I think the biggest learning that I will always take away and carry with me is we can't create interesting content if we don't sometimes ask tough questions, or ask
Mm-hmm.
questions designed to elicit really thought-provoking answers. But the way you interview for that is not the same way you would interview for, okay, tell me about your experience with procurement transformation, right?
Yeah.
And I never did a rotation through HR or anything like that. So I don't have any background that would necessarily prepare me for that, other than spending all of these years interviewing people and learning to listen. And you learn to listen for the tone of someone's voice. You learn to listen for the words that they say. But I also, in some of the conversations, remembered that sometimes what you're actually listening for is a silence. And in some cases, that silence means you've asked a really good question and the person wants to think a minute. In some cases, it may mean a follow up has caught them a little bit off guard. And in other questions, and there were a couple of times that I think this is what I heard, it's my interpretation. The silence indicated that I had assumed something in asking a question. And I certainly did my best to come to the project without bias. I learned everything I could. I was careful about my word choice. And yet every single person that I interviewed also came with different expectations. And some of the people that I spoke to, I'll be honest about this. Some of the people that I spoke to were angry.
Mm-hmm.
There's a frustration out there, and sometimes the anger was around our lack of ability to make progress. We certainly took head on during the project, and you were a part of a lot of these conversations, this very real issue that so many of our supplier diversity initiatives from the corporate side are box checking exercises.
Yep.
And we might sit around and pat ourselves on the back and say, you know what? We had a KPI that said that we were going to invite one diverse supplier to every single sourcing project or RFP that we did. And we did it 100%, go us. But the operational reality of that is that, let's say you invited 100 brand new diverse owned businesses to participate in RFPs over the course of the year. And did 5% of them get business? 2% of them? So you
Mm-hmm.
basically wasted the time and effort and sales resources of these businesses, many of which are small, not all, but a lot of them are small and resource constrained. They got very excited about these opportunities. And then if it doesn't pan out, let me tell you something. As suppliers and as consumers, they couldn't care less that you satisfied that metric to invite a new diverse owned business to every single RFP. That has worse than no meaning. And so there was frustration around that. There was also some frustration, I think, around the fact that while we talk about supplier diversity, what ultimately kicked off the current surge that we're seeing were the events of 2020. And so a lot of that was driven around racial equality. And
Yep.
yet, women owned businesses, disabled owned businesses, LGBTQ owned businesses, and veteran owned businesses are all benefiting from those events. And so I think those communities are certainly not going to look a gift horse in the mouth, right? They're taking this opportunity to build their networks and bring in new corporate members. But there was some frustration that, the fact of the matter is, especially within the Black American community, we suffered. And, we're not sorry that you're all benefiting, but there was a little bit of a discomfort that things were being sort of watered down or
Mm-hmm.
smoothed over. And that's what we do as corporations. That in order to make something happen at scale, you do often lose touch with some of the detail. I don't envy the job of supplier diversity managers. I spoke to some incredible people over the course of this project. Some were supplier diversity managers that just blew my mind. They were able to say, no, look, I have my KPIs. So, yes, it's a feel good initiative, but I can also show you how much we saved and how much we had an economic impact and how we moved the ball and how many different people we worked with to do it. And then I would talk to diverse business owners who would say, let me tell you the truth, these programs are a joke. It's
Mm-hmm.
a waste of my time. It's all lip service. Nothing's actually changing. It's expensive and administratively cumbersome for us to get and keep these certifications, and we're not winning business for them. So I think from a potential value standpoint, there's an awful lot that I think we should keep having the hard conversations and attempting to understand what can we control and measure within a corporation, but also understanding sort of the offset impact of those approaches on the suppliers and also the certifying organizations that we work with. But at the same time, I really started to realize towards the end of the 10 weeks we thought 2020 was a beginning. And I know supplier diversity is not new. I myself had contact with it 20 years ago.
Yep.
So it's not that it's new, but this was sort of a rebirth moment. And yet, even now, just not quite 2 years, now ESG is looming large. And I think the combination of diversity potentially rolling into ESG and also all of the other pressures that corporations are dealing with right now, war in Eastern Europe, fuel prices, inflation generally speaking, labor shortages. I think it's created a very complex puzzle, and there's only so much attention to be dedicated.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sort of ended the project with, I think the hope is people are driven to be involved in these programs. And as we distribute more buying authority out into the enterprise, there's been a huge push towards either self-guided buying or self-sourcing within procurement that actually increases the likelihood that decisions will be made based on value factors other than cost. But it's sort of colliding with these larger pressures and where all of that goes longer term and whether it's good or bad. We actually ended the very last LinkedIn Live audio discussion that we had was around, is it good or bad for supplier diversity to be rolled into ESG, which also includes, regulatory governance and environmental issues. And generally speaking, the opinion was it was a good thing because more attention and resources come with it.
Mm-hmm.
But I do worry, and maybe because I hear some of the frustrated voices in my head still, I worry about the individuals involved in this movement because for them, the true cause is racial equality, which
Yeah.
is rolled into diversity, rolled into ESG, maybe rolled into DEI, depending on your corporate structure. I don't think we have figured out where these initiatives are going. And I think we have to be very careful to continue investing, continue creating transparency, but being open to new shifts, because I certainly don't think we're on any kind of fixed trajectory.
It's interesting to hear you talk kind of about the current situation and how we see that procurement folks are talking a lot more about supply diversity and businesses are making commitments related to supply diversity, but that's not necessarily changing the trajectory of the discussion yet. Or there's still all this complexity that's being figured out of where it sits and how to get engaged and what the benefits still look like and all the things that you just talked about. I wonder if, as you go through this process, if there's kind of a piece of advice or an observation or a recommendation, that you took from the program, one that would be aimed at somebody on the practitioner side who's wanting to promote supply diversity internally and get more focus and turn that into action. And on the flip side, a diverse business. You spoke to a lot of diverse businesses of things that maybe they can do to make themselves more attractive, not as a diverse business, but as a business, to a practitioner. Anything that stood out or advice or recommendations or observations you made from those two perspectives?
Yeah, and I'll actually start with the supplier piece because you basically hit the nail on the head in your question that it's never about your diversity status or certification
Mm-hmm.
being your value proposition. And I was amazed in speaking to some of these business owners, and many of them would say to me, I don't rely on this. This is something that I maintain as a benefit to my customers, or I might use it occasionally to sort of seal a deal. But every single one of the businesses that I spoke with would have been an absolute rock star, regardless of what their identity was. They're just smart, hardworking, strategic people, and irregardless of identity, their businesses were going to be successful.
Yeah.
And so for business owners, do not expect this certification to be what makes you grow. Your value proposition has to make you grow. And then the certification might open a door. It might get you a little bit more business. It might get you more access. That's another great way to think about it. You say, hey, I'm in your diversity supplier program. I'd like to ask you some questions. Use that, right? I think on the corporate side, and this is very much a function of where we are right now, at one time, the challenge would have been probably for someone in procurement to go to the executive team and make the business case that it's necessary to have a supplier diversity program. Well, that's gone. There's really
Mm-hmm.
no issue with that anymore. Now, some executive teams are saying, what do you mean we don't have a formal supplier diversity program? Like everybody else has one. Quick, put one in place. But I think it's about seizing that momentum and keeping it strong. And I think the best ways to do that are things that play incredibly well to procurement strengths. One is around visibility. Even if the news isn't good and you purely keep it internal, benchmark, measure, track, report. That is absolutely critical. And it
Mm-hmm.
needs to be on a frequency. I won't be specific about what the frequency is because I think every company has a culture, sort of a time expectation. but make sure whatever sort of the reasonable update frequency is, make sure the supplier diversity program is reporting on that frequency. But I would also say making sure that we keep the program actionable at the very highest level. So the responsibility for building out supplier diversity certainly doesn't just exist within procurement. It doesn't just exist within a DEI office, not just sourcing people, not just decision-making stakeholders that are ultimately choosing contracts. It is truly a top-down initiative where we need to keep vision and action aligned. And so to that, I would say it's one of these old expressions. If you want to make a friend, ask someone a favor, right?
Right.
And not that anybody actually wants to be asked a favor or wants to be given another task to do, but I think it's about assigning responsibility in that you are both saying to this executive, and the request has to be specific. It has to relate to whatever their functional jurisdiction is. Listen, based on your purview and your responsibility and your access, this is the specific thing that I need you to do. So you're both creating an opportunity for action and accountability. And you're also showing this person the way forward because there really isn't training around this. There isn't education around, how do I do a better job with supplier diversity? A lot of it is just change management. And that's a point that I thought Jennifer Ulrich from CoreCentric made very effectively. This is another change management effort where we have to bring in passion and action and connect them together. And procurement is great at that. We're constantly
Yeah.
leading change management projects. So it's thinking of supplier diversity as enough different to require us to pause and say, okay, what's going to be the strategy? What's going to be the action plan? But also remembering this really does link to the things that we do all day long, we've done for years, and we're really, really good at. So I do continue to think that procurement is the right place to own supplier diversity.
Well, I know that you, as we talked about throughout the conversation, you created a lot of content. Hopefully this is the easy question for you to kind of wrap things up and put a bow on it at the end. Is there a single place that folks can go to who are interested in reading more and learning more about all the findings that you had throughout this program where they can go and find all that out?
Yes, as a matter of fact, and this was a great piece of exit advice I got from my LinkedIn coach, Victoria, right at the end of the project. So each Friday throughout the project, I actually summed up everything I had created during the week. And some of it was just links out to content, but I tried to also digest it because each of the 10 weeks had its own topic and focus. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you go to my LinkedIn profile, as I feel like I have to say, in my featured content, there are now 3, I think, really critical things that pull this project together. One is an article that outlines what was the main topic and main ideas of each week and who did I speak to for the whole 10 weeks with links right out to all the content. The second is every week I ran a poll, and the results of those were largely what we discussed in the LinkedIn Live audio events on Friday. But I promise it wasn't me. My graphic design work is the worst. I found someone to help me sort of take all of the data and build it into a beautiful infographic. So if you're looking for 9 really interesting different data slices on supplier diversity pulled together in one cohesive place, go look there. And then, as I had mentioned at the beginning, video was a huge required component of this program. And so clearly math is not my strong suit. I had to make 10 videos, and so I have 17. But I did make them into a YouTube playlist specifically around all of the content from the program. And so those also are all gathered together, linked in my profile in the featured content section.
Okay, perfect. Well, talking of links, we'll have to link folks to those content in our show notes
Absolutely.
page. So it's all in one place and you can go straight to it. So that will be, for anyone who's listening, go to artofprocurement.com/podcast. You'll find the list of all of our podcasts. This one with Kelly will be there, and you just click on the podcast and all the links to the content that Kelly shared will be right there. Kelly, I want to just wrap up by thanking you for kind of taking us through your journey today. And I think it was it's a real coup for procurement to be involved in this Accelerator program, because There wasn't really, I don't think, any other voices of procurement among the 100 creators. So to have the opportunity to talk about some of these topics, and I know that one of the things that you talked about was featured by LinkedIn as their insight of the day across the entire platform.
Yes.
So the more that we can do as a community to bring perspective and insights and education around these topics, I think really benefits us all.
Absolutely. No, it's nice to reflect back now that I have all of the work and everything under my belt. And I do think, as a final sort of thought, there was a great deal of interest. I was the only procurement creator. There was certainly interest, generally speaking, in the diversity topic. But people that don't know what procurement is are definitely interested in the opportunity to better understand what we do for the enterprise. And so I took it as a very positive sign that, very few eyes rolled back in heads. I didn't see that much eyes glazing. People were interested in the work that we do. And I think when we talk about our work, Helen's whole thing is she's crazy in love with procurement. I think she's dead on. I think we all should be. And hopefully, whether it's our team in Art of Procurement or whether it's individual people in our network participating in content, be passionate, because that makes everything that you do so contagious.
Well, on that note, Kelly, one last time, just thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Phil.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, an event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward